Welcome back to our deep dive series on neurodiversity, produced in partnership with Fundamental Foundations Counseling Center right here in Little Elm, Texas. The last two episodes, we really dug into this idea of neurodiversity. We debunked some myths, celebrated some strengths, but most importantly, we just tried to grasp how differently wired brains experience the world. And today we're kind of shifting gears a bit. We're going to tackle a topic that can be tough for anyone, but often presents unique challenges for neurodivergent individuals, and that's grief. So get ready to unpack how neurodiversity can really shape the whole grieving process. We've got some pretty eye-opening research and advice for families and caregivers, and it just might change how you think about loss and support. To help us break all this down, we have our expert back with us. Welcome back. Now, I know we've talked before about how grief is such a personal experience, but how does neurodiversity add like another layer to this whole thing?
It's a really great question. And it's really the core of why this topic is so important. When we talk about neurodiversity and how it impacts grief, we're not suggesting that neurodivergent individuals grieve more or less deeply than anyone else. It's really more about recognizing that their experience and how they express it can be significantly different.
Okay, so it's not about the intensity of the grief, but the way it shows up.
Exactly. Think about it. Neurodivergent individuals often have unique ways of communicating, processing sensory information, and regulating their emotions. All these things play a part in how they experience and go through loss.
That makes sense. So are we talking about things like someone on the autism spectrum maybe expressing their grief through changes in their routines, or someone with ADHD struggling with like fluctuating emotions, or maybe even just difficulty focusing on the whole grieving process?
You're hitting on some really key points. For someone on the autism spectrum, where routines and predictability are so important, even like a small change can be really unsettling for them. So imagine the huge disruption that comes from losing a loved one. Their grief might not show up in tears or words, but maybe in clinging to routines that are still there, or even creating new ones to cope with the change.
Wow, that's not something I had really thought about before.
Yeah.
It's easy to just assume that that kind of behavior is resistance or denial, but it's really their way of trying to process this huge shift in their world.
Exactly. And for someone with ADHD who might already have intense emotions and trouble regulating them, grief can feel like an emotional roller coaster. They might swing between extreme sadness, bursts of anger, and then even periods of seeming detachment.
So it's not that they aren't feeling the loss, it's just that their brain is processing it in a different way.
Yeah, that's a crucial thing to remember. Their grief is just as real. It's just expressed in ways that might not look like what we think of as typical.
Which is why I guess understanding these differences is so important, because otherwise we risk, misinterpreting their reactions, or even worse, dismissing their pain completely.
Absolutely. And that misunderstanding can make both the grieving person and their loved ones feel isolated and frustrated.
So how do we bridge that gap? Where do we even begin to try and understand how neurodiversity shapes the grieving process? I imagine it could look so many different ways.
It definitely can. Let's start with communication styles. For some neurodivergent individuals, verbalizing their feelings is really challenging.
Okay, so instead of saying, I'm sad, they might express it differently.
Exactly. They might use writing, art, music, physical activities, or even changes in their behavior to communicate their grief.
So silence or unconventional expression doesn't mean they aren't feeling it.
Right, and that's where honoring their unique experience is so important. We can't put our expectations on them for how they should grieve.
We have to meet them where they are and understand their individual needs.
Exactly. And while we're talking about needs, another big factor is sensory experiences. Remember those sensory sensitivities we talked about before? Well, they can become even stronger during times of grief.
Right, it's like everything's turned up when you're already feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed.
Exactly. Now imagine like a typical funeral. You've got lots of people, hushed whispers, maybe even strong sense of flowers or perfume.
For someone with sensory sensitivities, that could be a lot to handle. It might even trigger a meltdown.
Exactly. So we need to recognize that their sensory system is working overtime and not just judge their reaction.
So it's not about judging their reaction, but trying to understand what's going on for them. What can we do to support them in those kinds of situations?
It comes down to being flexible and creating an environment that's sensory friendly. Maybe offering noise-canceling headphones, or setting up a quiet room where they can take breaks. Or if it's too overwhelming, maybe even letting them participate remotely instead of in person.
It's almost like having a personalized grief plan.
That's a great way to think about it. It emphasizes that there's no one right way to support someone through grief, especially when we're talking about neurodiversity. And that brings us to another important point: processing time.
Right. We always hear about the stages of grief, but do those always apply? I mean, especially for neurodivergent individuals.
It's easy to think everyone grieves on the same timeline, but the reality is more complicated than that. Some neurodivergent individuals need more time to process a loss, and others might have reactions that are delayed.
So just because someone isn't showing grief right away doesn't mean they aren't affected by it.
Absolutely. Their grief might not show up for weeks or months or even years, and it might look very different from what we expect. That's where patience becomes so important. Pushing someone to move on before they're ready can actually make things harder.
Makes sense. It's about respecting their journey, even if it's not what we think of as normal.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about routines and structure. We know how important those are for many neurodivergent individuals. How does loss affect that?
That's another really important thing to consider. When someone dies, it changes those familiar patterns we have in life. For someone who needs routines to feel stable and in control, that can be really upsetting.
It's not just the loss itself. It's how it throws off their sense of order and predictability.
Exactly. So it's really helpful to try to keep as much routine as possible during times of grief. Obviously, some changes can't be avoided, but preparing them for those changes and explaining why they're happening can make a big difference.
So it's about giving them a roadmap even though the destination has changed. Are there any other ways grief might show up in neurodivergent individuals that we might not expect?
Sometimes they might cope by focusing intensely on specific details of the loss, or they might try to avoid thinking about it altogether.
So it's like their brain is trying to manage all those big emotions by either focusing on something concrete or just shutting down.
That's a really good way to put it. And it's so important for families and caregivers to remember that these are coping mechanisms. It's not that they don't care or aren't affected by the loss.
It sounds like communication is key here. How can families and caregivers best support neurodivergent individuals during a time like this?
Open and honest communication is really the most important thing. But it's not just about talking, it's also about listening and observing and trying to understand their needs.
So asking questions like, what's feeling especially hard right now? Or
Mm.
what would help you feel a little better?
Exactly. And using clear and straightforward language is important. We should avoid euphemisms because they can be confusing.
So instead of saying grandma went to sleep,
Right.
we should say grandma died.
Exactly. Honesty and clarity are really crucial, even when it's a tough subject. And remember, those sensory-friendly options we talked about, those are even more important when we're supporting someone through grief.
Things like noise-canceling headphones or dimmer lighting, or even a quiet space if they need a break from a gathering.
Right. It's about anticipating their needs and trying to reduce things that might cause stress. And like we talked about before, keeping routines as much as possible is another way to provide stability and comfort.
So things like sticking to meal times and bedtimes and familiar activities can make a big difference.
Definitely. Those routines are like anchors when everything else feels uncertain.
What about creative outlets? Can those help support neurodivergent individuals who are grieving?
Absolutely. Encouraging them to express themselves creatively can be really helpful, whether it's through art or journaling or music or dance or even building with Legos. It gives them a healthy way to process their emotions.
It's about letting them grieve in a way that feels true to them and safe.
Exactly. And that brings us back to patience. There's no set timeline for grief. It's so important to let neurodivergent individuals process their emotions at their own pace.
No pressure, no judgment, just support. Now, I know sometimes families can feel lost or overwhelmed even when they want to help. Are there any resources out there for people who need extra support?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that asking for help is a sign of strength. Therapists who specialize in neurodiversity and grief can be amazing resources. They can offer strategies and support for the person who's grieving and their family.
So if you're feeling lost or unsure about how to support your loved one, reaching out to a professional is always a good option. They can provide that expert perspective and guidance that can make all the difference.
Exactly. It's like having someone to guide you on a really complicated journey. And sometimes visual aids can be really helpful too, especially for people who have trouble with abstract concepts.
Like social stories, but for grief.
Yes, exactly. Social stories can be adapted to explain grief and what to expect in a way that's concrete and easy to understand. Timelines or charts can also help by showing the grieving process visually.
Like a visual roadmap to help them navigate something unfamiliar.
That's a great way to put it, because in a sense, that's what we're doing. We're giving them tools and support so they can find their own path through grief, a path that honors their unique needs and strengths.
It seems like so much of what we've been talking about today comes back to that idea of neurodiversity, that we need to celebrate differences
Yeah.
and recognize that there's no one right way to experience or express anything, especially when we're talking about something as powerful as grief.
You're absolutely right. It's about changing our perspective. Instead of judging, we should be curious. And instead of trying to make everyone fit in the same box, we should be embracing all the different ways people experience the world.
Recognizing that those differences aren't weaknesses.
Right.
They're just variations in how our brains work.
Exactly. And when we come to grief with that attitude, we can create an environment where neurodivergent individuals feel seen and heard and respected.
And when they feel that way, they're more likely to feel comfortable expressing their grief authentically, which ultimately helps them heal and move forward.
It's a beautiful cycle. Understanding benefits everyone, not just the person grieving, but also their families, their communities, and society as a whole.
Well, this has been a really insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure. And I hope our listeners, especially those here in Little Elm, feel more equipped to approach grief with an open mind and a compassionate heart.
And for our listeners in Little Elm, remember, if you're looking for more support or resources, Fundamental Foundations Counseling Center is a great place to start. They have a team of therapists who specialize in neurodiversity and grief, and they're ready to help you every step of the way. Before we go, I want to leave you with something to think about. How can we as individuals and as a community create spaces that are truly inclusive and supportive for neurodivergent individuals who are grieving? What small steps can we take to make a difference in their lives? We'll continue exploring more about neurodiversity in our next episode, so make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Until then, take care, be kind to yourselves, and keep those minds curious.
Take control of your mental health with our membership program. Enjoy priority scheduling, session rollovers, and in-office and virtual appointments when you need them. Fundamental Foundations Counseling Center offers affordable plans tailored to your needs because your wellness matters. Visit fundamentalfoundcounseling.com to join today.